Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this year's Braidwood Visiting Scholar Lecture. And good to see those who have braved the looming threat of a storm. We also see that there's quite a few online, but I particularly appreciate those of you who have come in person who have somehow, I think maybe actually found a way to stall the weather until we're finished this evening. So anyway, it's good to see you all, and it's a real pleasure to be able to introduce this evening, our speaker this evening, but in the context specifically of the Braidwood lecture. I was reminiscing over dinner about going back to when I was a student here many decades ago, when Bob and Linda Braidwood were still active here and coming in retirement, but coming in several days a week. And as a student, one of the highlights of the week was to go and spend the lunch hour in their lab listening to them regale us about stories of their time in the field. So it's really wonderful to have an occasion where we can, in their memory, bring into our community scholars who are doing really exciting and innovative kinds of scholarship and research in the spirit of the kind of innovative and pioneering work that they did many, many years ago. So our speaker this evening, Cheryl Makarewicz, is someone who is very much in that mold, engaged both in active and very exciting research in the lab, but also very committed and long-running field archaeologist. Cheryl has been a professor of zooarchaeology and stable isotope science at the University of Kiel in Germany since 2010, and since 2024, she also holds a dual professorship now also in the School for Archaeology and Maritime Cultures at the University of Haifa. She graduated cum laude with highest honors in anthropology and a minor in Near Eastern and Judaic Studies from Brandeis University, and going on to finish her PhD at Harvard, as well as postdoctoral work at Stanford. She directs several labs, as I mentioned, zooarchaeology and the Archaeology Stable Isotope Lab at Kiel University, as well as another isotope lab in Haifa, and supervises international cohort of graduate students and postdocs working with her on a wide range of different research projects, many of which with large grants. Just heard Cheryl mentioning this evening, something that we're all kind of on jittery, footing these days, given our own issues here, but just having completed a grant with the ERC in Europe. Cheryl considers herself an anthropological archaeologist, ultimately interested in the origins of village life and the spread of mobile pastoralism, understanding how animals and plants were used by human communities, not only as a means to daily subsistence, but also as a powerful vector for achieving particular sociopolitical goals. By documenting species abundance, distribution of different skeletal elements, animal age at death, and bone breakage, she is able to establish ancient hunting strategies, livestock production goals, feasting events, and culturally driven food preparation techniques. Her stable isotope biochemistry hat allows her to document the dietary and mobility histories of both people or human communities and animals, while also investigating how ancient cultivars were irrigated, manured, and harvested. Finally, as I mentioned, she is a dedicated field archaeologist, has worked for many, many years directing excavations of Neolithic village sites over 10,000 years old, including El Hema, Shahara, and Beda in Jordan. She's also done extensive field work throughout much of the Middle East, Russia, Kazakhstan, China, Uzbekistan, and Mongolia. Remarkable range. So really, you embody the spirit and goal of the Braidwood Memorial Lecture. So it's a real pleasure to be able to welcome you this evening to give a talk on the topic of the emergence of pastoralism east of the Jordan Valley. So if you please join me in welcoming Cheryl Makarewicz.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction. I really appreciate that. And it's really a delight and an honor to be here tonight to speak with you about some of my work and some of my longstanding interests in the origin of pastoralism. And as you may have just heard now, my work has really taken me all over, not only the Middle East, but also in Central Asia as well. But I consider sort of my core area of really working in the Near East, and that's what we're going to focus on tonight. So, right, wanted to start kind of out with this picture, this lovely picture here, of a Bedouin family from the probably 1890s or so. These are from some of these archives that were photographs in Jerusalem, I believe. And what do we see here? We see lots of sheep and goats. We see a hair tent. We see, people preparing foods in the background. This is sort of the image that we, I think, as Near Eastern archaeologists often kind of think of when we're thinking about pastoral nomadisms. There is an element here of almost a pastoral stereotypes, if one may. Even we as archaeologists, we, as I said, we tend to think about this kind of image. And we think of pastoralists often as being economically on the edge. And this photograph sort of, maybe kind of gives that image a little bit. We also tend to think of pastoralists as being part of what are called agriculturalist dependencies, that pastoralists are completely dependent somehow at the end of the day on their sedentary neighbors who are growing grains, and that they are sort of beholden ultimately to their agriculturalist neighbors. The other sort of stereotype about pastoralism that I think this image also sort of invokes is that there's no wealth generation by pastoralists, that pastoralists are kind of really living from year to year. Maybe they can accrue a few animals here and there, a little bit of boom bust, but overall they can't generate long-term wealth. And ultimately, the sort of idea that many archaeologists that we have is that pastoralists are sort of aimlessly wandering in search of graze, perpetual movement, and that they're kind of a path and not a place. And altogether, these kinds of sort of misconceptions or stereotypes, or however you want to put them, results in, when we think about the origins of pastoralism and the emergence of that in the Near East and its spread elsewhere, is that we have sort of a past pastoralism that's frozen kind of in the future present. This is what we think of when we're thinking about pastoralism in prehistory. And I wanted to show you this particular photograph here. This is from some of the work that I did a few years ago out in the Jaffa Basin with Bedouin groups who are conducting falconry hunting. They're capturing falcons. They're using them to capture game. They're engaging in lots of different kinds of social activities while they're doing this. And I wanted to show you this picture because I think, first of all, it's just a wonderful picture with these elegant animals, with these birds of prey. And you can see how these guys are really just into this whole scene here. But it also really emphasizes that pastoralism is really a multi-species engagement, okay? They're mutually constructed kind of co-relationships. And today we're going to talk largely about sheep and goats, okay? But pastoralism takes many, many different forms. There's lots of other taxa involved. You can have cattle, you can have horses, you can have camels, you can have falcons, you can have all kinds of other things. So I just kind of want to remind you of that today as we're talking, and again, focusing largely on sheep and goats, but there are other taxa at other places in the world that are involved that are equally important, just in very, very different subsistence and also social and symbolic ways. I think ultimately when we're talking about pastoralism, we think pastoralism is mobility, and it is. It's part and parcel of what it is means to be a pastoralist. There are many terms, there are many types of pastoralism. These are just sort of like a little list of this. Agropastoralism, where you have sort of farming communities who are heavily invested in also raising sheep and goats and perhaps cattle, in some cases pigs as well. Tethered pastoralism, where you have your animal herds and you kind of go out and back, but you never go out too far because it's a little bit scary out there. Then we have more of a seasonal transhumance, where you have people moving with their herds on a sort of preset round that's sort of pursued year after year. And then we have also nomadism, where you're, again, a path and not place. as you're kind of chasing after pastures. What's important to remember here is when we're talking about pastoralism in sort of the human story is that pastoralism really was a very late development in the polycentric kind of multi-trajectory Neolithic transition from hunting and gathering to food production. But this was a really big one. It was a big transformation. It's one that really transformed how humans could survive and even thrive in challenging landscapes. So the question then remains is how and why did pastoralism emerge and how did it sort of really kind of hang on? And we really know surprisingly little about this process. And we often do frame pastoralism in any context, whether we're talking about the Near East or Central Asia or elsewhere, as an economic adaptation or a subsistence adaptation that is really just a response to climate change or even resource stress. So there are lots of long-standing models that largely look to large village-type settlement sites that are kind of the fount for step-based mobile pastoralism. And these models are really ultimately about resource competition. So Gary Rolfson has long argued for seasonal splitting of communities. So you have a portion of the community that's dealing with crops while the other half moves livestock a good distance away from those settlements, away from those agricultural plots to distant pastures. In other words, this is sort of about a competition for space, as it were. And they look to, for example, in this case, in the Near East, to Ain Ghazal, which is a major site in the Jordanian highlands, and cite this kind of architecture, these semi-subterranean corridor houses, as kind of an architectural evidence for a mobile portion of the population. And so what you're looking at here is that these small spaces in your structure on the right here are interpreted to indicate storage for goods while the household is away, kind of out there tending sheep and goats. And so this is really about keeping animals off the crops, making sure that, that's disarticulated and then everybody kind of comes back together. So that portion of the community is moving away, deals with the animals, then comes back later on. So people are always going out and coming back. This is often logically followed by pastoral nomadism. So eventually this process continues and eventually those groups will disarticulate sort of permanently. And then those nomads spread further and further out, kind of blindly following the grass and fulfilling the archetype of a wandering nomad. So that's one particular model that we see over and over again in many Near Eastern contexts, not only the Neolithic. We also have what I would call sort of demographic push models or crisis models, and they really abound in theorizing about the origins of pastoralism. And these are kind of a variation on conflict competition models, but they're rather than being a tension over agricultural land and the grains that land produce, it instead is really about degradation and sometimes outright destruction of the landscape. And the model is very simple. With the advent of farming and the energetic surplus and stability generated largely by wheat and barley cultivation, villages generated quickly very large populations that place such pressure on resources of farmland and pasture that landscapes become degraded, and they become denuded. And this overtilling and overgrazing made pasture unstable, which forced some population to relocate their livestock out into the steppe zone. So people are really kind of dragging their feet, heading out there. And another variant on this resource stress model is just the onset of environmental crisis. There's a crisis that's going to be onset of drier conditions that are further reducing that productivity of pasture and also of agriculture as well. You can also have the opposite, and this model also pops up now and then, is that another variant of this resource model is the onset of really nice conditions. People race out and try to get that graze. And so people are following these pastures, they're following this abundance of forage for their animals, and they're willingly going and they are making their way out. And this is how pastoralism becomes established. And sort of the final model that we often look to here in many contexts is local hunter-gatherers taking up livestock and refashioning it their own way. And sort of, there used to be an old Burger King sort of commercial that said, have it your way. So these hunter-gatherers are doing their thing, and then they're getting these animals, and then they're having it their way. And I think this is a really interesting take because it really gives primacy to hunter-gatherers. It's really actually a kind of antithesis to these very old school migration and replacement models that are frequently used to describe change. But the real bugbear, I think, in this particular model is the outstanding difference between hunting and herding. And I don't mean here the difference between immediate returns granted by hunting and delayed returns offered by herding. What I'm really referring to here is the difference is practice, all right? Hunting and herding involve two entirely different animal-centered knowledge sets. You have to know completely different species-specific aspects of animal behavior, of forage preference, production, reproduction, and also animal care. You also have to think differently about seasonality of landscape use, about how these animals might impact your own mobility and your settlement. We really can't underestimate how tricky it is to take care of a herd of sheep and goats. So to think that hunter-gatherers can automatically just pick those animals up and run with it, I think is a bit much to ask for these kinds of models. So we see these models played out over and over again, whether it's in the Near East or the Caucasus Mountains, the Central Asian steppe. And I do find these models somehow kind of unsatisfying and really lacking in explanatory power. Competition or environmental dynamics or changes in landscape productivity probably weighed in some cases, but I'm not really convinced that these variables really explain how pastoralism was initiated and how it actually stuck. Pastoralism, and however we define it, using loaded terms or what have you, pastoralism really involves very different tempos and rhythms in daily life compared to settled agricultural villages. It's such a total transformation in cultural lifeways that environmental and demographic factors as an impetus to change and stay with it doesn't really cut it. So the question is, can we escape the tyranny of these resource stress models that look to climate change or overexploitation as a push to pastoralism? How might have mobile pastoralism emerged independent of these factors? And I think most important, why and how did mobile pastoralism become canalized? How did it really stick? Why did people hang on to it once they started experimenting with it? So that's what we're going to tackle tonight, to think about the emergence of pastoralism and the very processes that not only sparked it, but really sustain mobile communities dependent on bovine livestock. And to start this story, we have to reach all the way back into the pre-modern Neolithic, some 10,000 years ago, east of the Jordan Valley. So I can't do a total exhaustive, here's the entire pre-modern Neolithic, but I'm going to try to draw out some real crucial aspects I think are setting the stage for some of our developments 1,000 years later when we're looking at the emergence of pastoralism. So in many ways, our story starts in the polycentric multi-trajectory transition from hunter-gatherer to food production. So in the past 25 years, we've really moved far beyond single-center models. And in terms of domestication, we've moved way beyond these wild and domestic plants, wild domestic animal dichotomies as well. And what we are now finding out, even just from this particular map here, is that we have pre-domestication cultivation in multiple regions across Southwest Asia. For example, we have barley in the green. They're experimenting in the southern Levant, in the northern Levant, in the upper Euphrates. They're doing things with chickpeas in the southern Levant. They're also, it turns out they're doing it further to the north as well. In the north, they're experimenting with wheat. There's lentils, there's fava beans. There's loads of other cultivars. And this process in the PPNA is initiated, and it's just kind of going gangbusters. And you can just imagine this kind of fermenting of ideas kind of going back and forth between all of these communities across this region. When we're looking at animal domestication a little bit later during the pre-modern Neolithic B, we sort of have a similar situation emerging there as we saw with plant cultivation. So for example, we have goats, and we're going to talk about goats because that's much of our story today. We're getting initial experimentation with these animals up in the Zagros region. And a couple hundred years later, we're seeing independent management and independent trajectories for experimentation with goat husbandry in the southern Levant. They're also doing strange things like lugging morphologically wild goats and putting them on boats and bringing them to Cyprus as well. So there's lots of strange things going on here. And again, there's that ideas and these technologies are being sort of transferred. We say the same thing with sheep. Where we're getting early experimentation across a wide swath of the Euphrates region and also in Anatolia. There was a very nice paper that just came out the other day on sheep domestication in the ancient genome there. And we have, again, they're sticking more sheep on boats and bringing those also to Cyprus. And those animals start spreading further down into the northern Levant and further into the south, and also out to the east as well. The point here being is that, again, there's lots of experimentation going on. There's a lot of back and forth, and there's lots of different tempos at which this is happening in various regions of Southwest Asia. Along this whole sort of time of bubbling, sort of, trying to figure out how to grow plants and grow animals in a sense, there's lots of things going on in terms of the built environment as well. So we head back for a second back to the PPNA. So in addition to their cultivation activities, they're really experimenting with the built environment as well. Now, we don't know how sedentary PPNA people were, but what these PPNA settlements are really broadcasting is a very intense investment in space and place. The built environment, in a sense, is rising. It's really thick with structures. There's repeated occupations. There's intentional closures of buildings, followed by construction of new ones right on top of it. These settlements are now also, in a sense, homes for the dead. There are burials being regularly placed underneath floors as well as elsewhere, and creating sort of an additional attachment to place. What's also notable is most of these PPNA settlements, they share certain construction techniques. There's, as you can see from this picture here, there's semi-subterranean structures, there's Pise buildings, stone buildings, or a mix of both media. And it has this very distinctive PPNA feel. When you're excavating these sites, you'll really kind of get that sense when you're really kind of in the ground. But what's interesting is that there's no real formatting of building types across the region. Much of it is very much choose your own adventure, architecturally speaking, across the region. And so this suggests that even though PPNA communities are highly connected and they participate in the same knowledge transfer networks, especially with respect to like lithic technologies and also plant cultivation, and they're exchanging material culture, they're bringing beads back and forth, they're exchanging shells. Each community is driving their own environment, built environment bus, if you may. And we see this commonality of eclecticism in the communal architecture as well. So these PPNA villages all feature communal architecture of some stripe amidst all of these dense networks of single, what we think are more domestic type structures. This is an example here of a centralized seed storage. This is a granary. So they're sharing the harvest. They're sharing, crucially, also the seeds for the next growing season. And this is really suggesting that key aspects of human experimentation with plant cultivation is a communal endeavor. It's not the outcome of particular households going it alone. And it may be also that tending of these plots was communal as well. And if not, then cultivating was an activity very much under the eye of the community. These PPNA sites are usually located on well-watered alluvial fans and these are exactly the kinds of places you want to put your cultivation plots. We have other kinds of communal structures like this very, very large one at W16. This is about 20 meters across. This is, you can see this sort of stepping, almost amphitheater-like kind of construction. This was a space that was used for daily practices, grinding grains, processing carcasses and so on and so forth, but it was also a place for more ritualistic public kinds of performance. And this kind of structure really brought together the community, again, on a daily basis, but also for more energetic sort of events that were maybe much more irregular, but sort of constant in appearance. There's also communal mortuary structures. There's not only individuals buried under the households, but they're also placed in these kinds of structures like we see at Al-Hema here, where we have this large structure here with special stone furniture designed for the dead, where the dead are inserted into these kind of stone kists sitting up. And this structure is also open. Anybody can come and visit it. So that open end that you see towards the bottom of the screen here, that's looking out over the hillside. So this is very much exposed. It's very much part of the community. It's very much present on a day-to-day basis. So this centrality of communality that organized PPNA societies was maintained and even enhanced as food production intensified. So in the southern Levant, we have during the middle PPNB an experimentation with goat husbandry. And goats are suddenly really, really important. Before they were all hunting gazelle, but now goats are on the scene. And you can see from the picture here, these are not tiny little dinky domesticated goats. These are morphologically wild goats with their big scimitar horns, very large body. And people are sort of messing around with foddering them, with controlling perhaps their movement, in perhaps an attempt to enhance the reliability and the predictability of their own food resources. And the built environment is also changing too. So you can see now by the middle PPNB, this architecture is getting kind of squared off. You can see all kinds of plaster floors. And we can see at sites like Khorasan and Ain Ghazal, this kind of plastering. And in Khorasan and Ain Ghazal, these middle PPNB sites, the built environment is becoming denser. Most of those buildings are really kind of stacked next to each other. Whereas opposed to places like Moza and Yiftachal, those structures are similar in sort of footprint, but they're much more spaced out. There's a lot more space in between those buildings there. We're starting to see also lots of intra-regional diversity in the formats of the built environment. During the middle PPNB now, if we go further south into southern Jordan, we get sites like Ain Abu Nakela and Shakrat Maziad, as well as Beta, where we have the semi-subterranean kind of honeycomb-like structures built in these very, very densely packed, constrained spaces. Now, all of this experimentation with animal management, this nascent husbandry of goats, is aligning with continuity in communal structures that we saw in the PPNA. These communal structures remain super important. And for example, this one here at Beta, very large structures, about, I don't know, 8 meters across or so. And if you're looking at it right now, you're thinking, boy, that's a really boring looking building compared to the ones that we saw before. And it is terribly boring. When we excavated this, Diana Kirkbride, she had excavated the portion on the right that you can see it's down to sand there. And we decided to open up the other half because there was talk of, there was an altar in the middle. So like, let's go dig the altar. And so we're digging this and we're digging this, and we came down on this sort of flagstone, and you can see there's a post hole there. There was another post hole, which we actually covered up. And that's it. This was sort of like a rec room. It's like the Y of the community. You could just come in there and you kind of do your thing, shoot the breeze with people. There's no indication that there was impactful ritual taking place here. But what this building was important. You can see how it's wonky. They know how to make ovals at this point in time. And you can see on the left side here, it's circular and then goes. And what's happened is that at some point, this building collapsed into the nearby wadi that's running through there. And this building was so important, despite the fact that it's so boring looking, is that they rebuilt it with a sort of yucky little wall here on the left, and they just try to wiggle it in on the edge of the wadi. So the point being is that this communal structure, as boring as it may be, was such an important feature of this of the settlement at Beta, is that they reconstructed and they jammed it in here and to make sure that it was still usable. They're still doing dramatic stuff, though, down here as well. This is at Shakrat Maziad. They have communal mortuary structures as well, just like we saw in the PPNA. And this particular structure is just sort of chock full of skeletons and also skulls. There's these bin features, for example, on the right, where it was just sort of jam-packed with skulls. We have evidence also for feasting. This is from the site of Kfar Khoresh on the right, where there's a big boss pit where there was interred the remains of several boss individuals that would feed hundreds of individuals. And there was on the top of the pile of boss bones, there was human remains. So ostensibly, it was probably part of some kind of ritual mortuary practice associated with the death of this individual. And there's also the communal hunt of, in order to get those aurochs, and you got to go out with your community to get those aggressive, scary aurochs. And this is a painting on the left, reconstruction from Chatal. Of course, that's in Anatolia. It's not pre-Proto Neolithic, it's late Neolithic. But I think that painting sort of exemplifies that communality of the hunt. And there's still burials under houses like we saw in the PPNA, but they're now removing these skulls and they're doing things with them. And that includes not only removing those skulls, but also plastering them as well. And these are part of cross-generational social leveling mechanisms that are bringing together communities where we see the death of an individual, and over days, that's the household celebrates that. Then there's a primary burial days later. Then after years of that individual being under the house floor, the skull is removed, and after more days or years or even longer, that skull is then painted, it's plastered. It's often, and that can take days and years, days to years. And then there's probably secondary household celebrations as all of these skulls and plaster skulls are collected between households, and then they're placed in pits elsewhere in the settlement. So this is a very long-term kind of transgenerational commemorative events that are, again, bringing together people through these mortuary practices that involve successive kinds of celebrations that cross-cut households. And if there's public venerations and there's probably parades, there's these statues, for example, that we have from Ein Gazal, also in Jericho as well, where these statues we think were probably being brought out. And then when they're finished with them, they're also ritually interred. So altogether, these communal structures are for performances. These are elaborate, temporally extended mortuary practices. All the feasting, putting the dead together, mortuary structures, this all help bind people together through multiple avenues simultaneously. Many of these PP&E communal structures physically brought people together for quotidian everyday practices that really enhance knowledge transmission. And this in turn creates, and this is important, communities of practice that really help to cement new subsistence practices like plant cultivation and animal husbandry, or transfer knowledge like about stone tool manufacture. And those more dramatic, socially cohesive ritual practices brought people together in a completely different way. They are by creating these kinds of emotionally charged, dramatic, and very crucially, very memorable events that would be long remembered by the community, that kind of serve as a reference point that would bind the community together long after the event had finished. And suddenly this lovely communal middle PP&B world, it ends. We have this explosion in late PP&B settlement in the Jordanian highlands, and all of these settlements sort of pop up. You get these massive sites up to 14 hectares in size. You've got two-story architecture, stone, there's stairways, there's windows, there's doors. These are really very, very big settlements. In terms of the internal footprints of these, you have all of these small rooms. They're not easily accessible. You have to go through an internal warren of doors and internal windows to access these spaces. And even the larger rooms here are quite hidden. You have to descend into them either by stone stairs or a ladder. Why did this happen? There's arguments that there was a middle PP&B migration from the West, and that you have populations that are sort of quickly moving over and they're establishing these late PP&B settlements. But there's really little evidence for population packing west of the Jordan Valley. So I don't find this a particularly satisfying explanation for this, what we're seeing here for the beginning of the late PP&B. Again, we just saw some of these middle PP&B structures over there, and it's, again, rather diffuse kinds of settlement patterns, and also internally within those communities themselves. I think what's really happening is we're getting a reorganization of densely occupied middle PP&B sites in southern Jordan. We saw sites like Beta and Shakrat Mazyad that we really have this kind of tight packing going on here. And there could also be, and this is crucial, underneath these late PP&B settlements, there could be middle PP&B sites there. Because we never take the late PP&B sites down, because it's hard to take down a 2, 3, 4 meter tall wall. And you don't want to, because they've been there forever. So it's very likely that there are middle PP&B settlements under these late PP&B kinds of sites. What's important, though, is that there is a dramatic increase in settlement size during the late PP&B. And what's happened is you don't know everyone anymore. It's filled with your kin, but it's also filled with kind of quasi-strangers. They're people you know, but you don't really know them, all right? And that's dramatically different from before. In terms of food production, we're getting it seems to be a major intensification in agricultural production. We're getting domesticated wheat now. We still have pre-domestication cultivation of barley, but there's groundstone galore. And there should be a picture of lots of groundstone, but these late PP&B sites, there's groundstone everywhere. They are really, really going for it. There's also a shift in storage practices. The storage game really changes dramatically during the late PP&B. And so all these storage spaces are these small rooms that are about a meter and a half wide. They're entirely enclosed within these structures. And these spaces can't be accessed from exterior points. They can only be accessed from the interior of the structures via these small half-door entrances. So as rooms in their own right, these spaces really offer quite a bit more storage volume compared to middle PPB installations. But unlike middle PPNB storage, which was situated in very visible kind of working areas, in those working areas in the middle PPNB where that storage was, that's the spaces where repetitive food processing took place and highly personalized inter and inter-household social activities could take place. But these late PPNB storage areas, they're completely hidden, they're highly controlled. That stored material is hidden, which is interesting. But more importantly, the opportunities for social exchange are basically zero. You're not going to have a bunch of people kind of in there processing grain in your tiny 1x5 little rooms. So that absence of elements in the late PPNB built environment that cross-cuts households. There's no shared granaries. There's no large communal structures. There's no transgenerational mortuary practices. This is it. This is all that from the middle PPNB, from even the PPNA, that's all gone. That communality is gone. And this is really, the absence of that is pointing to a real major reconfiguration how PPN societies were organized. Community is out. Those emotionally charged charismatic events such as skull plastering, feasting, done. And it's even as if the built environment is almost choking off opportunity. It's choking off these chances for spontaneous or atypical kind of social interactions. It's limited them to these kind of highly structured, repetitive daily practices that take place within the household, and they're constructed and they're reproduced and renewed again and again in this very constricted built environment, kind of imparting a rigidity in social organization and creative social action. So it seems really doom and gloom here, but we have a new element here. Here are finally our sheep and goats. And these are domesticated sheep and goats. These are your little tiny sheep and goats. They're coming down from the northern Levant. These are not kind of an outgrowth from the goat management that was happening earlier. That's something that was indigenous happening in the southern Levant. This looks like it's being replaced by sheep and goats coming from the north. So these animals are marching down. At the same time, all of these late PPNB structures are being built. So altogether, the introduction of the sheep and goats, it's not just, hey, there's a new way to eat meat around here, but these sheep and goats could possibly really ignite and reconfigure how the landscape was used, how those spaces were set aside for agriculture and pastures needed for herders. And if you're herding sheep and goats, you have to figure out how to wring out more pasture and graze out of this kind of increasingly busy and packed landscape filled with people competing for limited resources. And at the same time, you're stuck in what appears to be increasingly constrained late PPNB social world, where those sheep and goats, they're your ticket to the landscape. And that's your way to interact with the landscape in different ways than you would with cultivation or hunting. So we now have to think about mobility. Are people out and about in this late PPNB world, and how so? So I'm just going to briefly touch a few points here and about tracking mobility via the isotopic record. So we have to think a little bit about isotopes, and isotopes are a way of tracking human and animal dietary intake. It's also a way of tracking environmental inputs in the skeletal tissues. I won't go into huge detail about this, but you would think automatically, let's go sample some humans. Unfortunately, enamel tissue doesn't work very well, your teeth. We have very complex enamel formation processes that go in our teeth. And so it doesn't really allow for very good resolution for tracking mobility. The other problem is it's the wrong period of life. Your teeth form when you're a kid, and you don't have lots of agency usually when you're a kid. So we might be looking at something slightly different there. Plus, we have very few late PPNB burials, so that's going to be difficult. Bones are kind of out. Complex geometry really doesn't allow for very good resolution when you're tracking mobility. You're also getting a dietary and mobility averaging, because as you move, your bone's always remodeling. We also have a major problem with bone that when it's in the ground, it's really susceptible to chemical change in the burial environment. So you get what's called diagenetic alteration, and the isotopic composition of that bone material can change. So let's just go straight to the sheep and the goat. Let's look at the animals themselves. And let's not do this only because they're really the engine of change that we're thinking about in the late PPB and also pastoralism, but because tooth formation for sheep and goats is much different from that of people. the way goat teeth and sheep teeth are formed is it allows us to look at environmental and dietary information at seasonal scales, which means we can look at mobility over the course of a year within a single tooth. So which isotopes are appropriate for tracking mobility? We're going to be looking today at strontium, which largely tracks geology more or less. We'll take a look at oxygen isotopes, which is dependent on temperature, but also precipitation amount. So basically, the colder it is, the lower your oxygen isotope values are. The warmer it is, the higher those values are. And we're also going to look briefly at carbon isotopes, which is a vegetation, and that works kind of the same way as oxygen. So when it's warmer, the carbon isotope values are higher, and when it's cooler and when there's less, or when it's cooler and it's wetter, those carbon isotope values go down. I just want to show you that strontium isotopes across the southern Levant, it's really underdetermined. So if you were in someplace like France, you would have, or Central Europe, you have wild variation in strontium isotopes. But even if you're not an isotope expert, you can see that that y-axis isn't very, very big in a sense. So we're dealing with the challenge here of low variation and underdetermined strontium isotopes across the landscape. And we're kind of working on this right now. We're busily sampling our way across the southern Levant to try to capture strontium isotopic variation and kind of link that up closer, not only with the geology, but also with soil formation and other elements as well. And this is this should say oxygen isotopes are sensitive to environmental inputs. But basically, as you get with more rainfall, the more blue it is. This is backwards, unfortunately. I thought I could change this. The more blue on this screen means that the oxygen isotope values are lower. And if it's less blue, that means the oxygen isotope values are higher. So again, tracking aridity. And the same thing we can see across these very varied topographies of the southern Levant, going from the coast up to the Jordan Valley and down to the Dead Sea and coming back up to the highlands. You can see that's changing the oxygen isotope composition as you go up and down. The same thing goes with carbon isotopes, also sensitive to environmental inputs. We're in our Mediterranean zones near the coast. They have very, very low carbon isotope values because there's a lot more rain. It's cooler. And as you go further and further east, the carbon isotope values are higher, reflecting the lack of water, increased aridity, and also plants of different photosynthetic pathways that are specially adapted to highly arid conditions. Both isotopes shift on a seasonal basis. And that's something that we can really sort of use to look at mobility. So let's just turn here quickly to Ain Ghazal. Again, even if you're not a strontium isotope, you're not a purveyor of strontium isotopes. You can see here we have some middle PPMB goats, and they're really not going anywhere, which is an interesting story in itself, in that these are sort of early managed animals. They're being controlled. It seems that their movement is very constricted. But during the late PPMB, that suddenly changes. And that these animals are now being moved around, and some of them are being moved around, relatively speaking, quite a bit, some kinds of distances. So something's really opening up in the late PPMB, that these animals now are being moved intentionally in that kind of increasingly packed landscape. And we see this at other sites as well. And a lot of these late PPMB sites are also located in these funny places like El Hema and Es Safia, which are at the bottom of these major wadi systems. So what we're looking at here on the right, that's the bottom of the Wadi Hassan, the bottom of the Wadi Mujib, respectively. And you can see at the top of the plateau, that's the nice Mediterranean plateau where it can be quite green up until early summer. And then on the bottom of the wadi systems is much drier. So you have higher carbon isotope values because you have less water, and also because you have C4 plants, which are specially adapted to arid conditions. So the question is, we have strontium isotope values from these two sites, but it doesn't look like they're really moving. But this is a funny landscape, as you just saw. So is it just because are these strontium isotope data saying they're not moving at all, or is it just the resolution is not good enough for the distance that they're moving? These are oxygen and carbon isotope sequences taken from teeth from fallow deer from the southern Levant. And if you're stationary, those carbon oxygen isotopes should track each other throughout the season. And that's what we were looking at here. And so that means that's the pattern you would expect to see if those animals are not moving. But if we look at our late PPNB animals from Alhama and also from Sophia, we see the exact opposite. Those curves are going in opposite directions. What's happening is that during the summer, or the late spring and early summer month, is those animals are actually going up to the top and they're getting the good graze where it's nice and green. And during the wintertime, they're coming back down to the bottom. So what we're looking at here is a kind of vertical transhumance. They're going up and down and they're out and about, and that landscape is now opening up because of this novel sheep and goat herding. So we've got transhumance in the late PPNB. We've got sort of a nascent form of pastoralism. And that's fantastic because it's great for the animals and they're going to be well fed and all these kinds of things. And this is part of the evolution of domestication processes and so on and so forth. But what this is even more interesting is that transhumance really gives herders the chance to get out of the built environment and let them leave behind the social world of sedentary communities. Now that built environment, remember, it's a physical place. It's a space where everyday actions take place, but it's also a highly constructed frame of symbolic reference. And while this frame of reference orders the social world of community, it's also a very highly restrictive one. So the social norms and there's political realities that structure communities, they become extremely rigid because they're constantly being kind of regenerated by daily practices that take place within that built environment. So in late PPNB settlements, that social calcification must have hardened with the loss of communal structures used for ritual events and quotidian activities alike. But there's a whole landscape out there. There's a whole landscape of which the tasks that are concerned with subsistence and resource acquisitions are carried out. And a whole landscape that by virtue of the lack of a built environment may be defined socially in ways that are totally different compared to those community settlements. So vertical transhumance and intensification in animal husbandry really changed the taskscapes of the late PPNB world. And those taskscapes are an array of related activities whose temporality is really oriented by social relations between participants. And by performing their own tasks, individuals are attending to the tasks of others, and this really enlivens the taskscape to one of mutual involvements to create a network of interrelationships and rhythmic practices and concordant social relations. So collecting fodder, watering animals, all part of a newly created late PPNB pastoralist taskscapes, but is important and it's creating opportunities, but moving animals to these more distant pastures for chunks of time really creates new interactive arenas that are away from the eye of the community. So transhumance is actually conferring a kind of social freedom to herders because it transcends the constructs of daily household practice and attendant social structures. So vertical transhumance and very crucially, the long seasonal scale amounts of time spent on pastures really provides an alternative social world to the one provided by the household and the built environment. And it's not a haphazard collection of individual agents. There's got to be a lot of coordination out there. And because pasture usage and fodder collection and all this kind of other pastoralist activities requires coordination as well as mobility, the strategies themselves, these animal management strategies become nodes of interaction and discussion. And consequently, that taskscape is really packed with pools of social and political potential that are completely different from those in the built environment. So these developments in animal husbandry practice of nascent pastoralist activity in the form of transhumance really kind of fomented the formation of novel practice networks that sit well outside the built environment and the confines of the community. So these nodes are places of action where pasturing is occurring, et cetera, and these different nodes are attracting individuals who are employing similar practices in order to execute a defined strategy. And doing so, these individuals are forming multiple practice networks that are outside of the community. And this is where all the action, and this is where all the non-kin, non-household, inter-community interaction is going to occur. And it's where the negotiation of practice takes place. It's where the scheduling is worked out, access to resources such as graze and water is negotiated, and so on and so forth. And as part of this discourse within these discrete kind of practice networks, there are these kinds of proximal transfers of highly specific sets of subsistence-related knowledge. And piggybacking onto that social knowledge carried out from these households is transformed, it's codified in new knowledge sets accessible by virtue of the specificity of the task being performed only to those who are participating in that practice network. So basically, this nascent transhumance is in kind of fomenting these practice networks, and they're creating new lines of communication that are cross-cutting households. They're circumventing the unitary power of the household to decide, and it's stepping aside from community-dictated ways of doing. So these are kind of autonomous communication portals that are providing a medium through which individuals can kind of coalesce with other like-minded practitioners, and they can pursue their own social and political motivations outside the social constructs engendered by the built environment. So these practice networks, as they're played out in the landscape, really provides a means in which multiple actors can escape the daily practices that codify structures and societies. And in essence, they're kind of breaking the chains of household and community. And this is the socio-political dimension that really makes pastoralism stick. Pastoralism emerges not because people are fleeing resource stress in the core, or you have hunter-gatherers kind of anticipating future resource stress, and they're looking to diversify their subsistence base. It's because a new taskscape has taken hold that provides social and political opportunities for participating agents. So pastoralism is politics. So we've got these transhumans going on, and does the story end there? Well, not quite, because when we think pastoralist and we're going back to our stereotypes, we're thinking people out in the big nothing. We're not out in the big nothing yet. So let's just very, very briefly get out of that lush Mediterranean zone in the Jordanian highlands. Let's get out east to the Badia, kind of in the southern corner of Jordan. And so we're going to head kind of where that circly area is down there on the right side. And I want to take a look very briefly at these so-called PPNB desert outposts. And what we have on the left there, you can see these are our late PPNB settlements, and about 50 kilometers or so to the east, maybe a little bit less in some cases, you have new settlements out there. They're also late PPNB, but they're slightly a little bit later in the PPNB. So we have settlements out there. We have sites like Wadi Abu Talea. We have settlements. We have water barrages. We have cisterns. There's wadi barriers. There's all kinds of modifications going on in the landscape out there that are made so that individuals can inhabit this area even though there's not a lot of water. There's also small-scale agriculture, which is really helped along by these barrage systems. And there's loads and loads of gazelle bones, okay? So, and they're all neonatal, so they're springtime use. And this is just a picture here of these cisterns and these barrages that are kind of composed with the excavator calls the triple set, the settlement, the barrage, and the cistern. And there's many examples of these out in this area of the Jaffa Basin. And we have, on top of all these gazelle, though, we have this trace appearance of sheep and goats as well. So we've got lots and lots of gazelle, and we have a few sheep and goat bones, all right? And that's it. But something else is going on out there. We've got some neat rock art. I just want to show you this. This is another triple set PPNB outpost site. And you can see this rock art over here that's within the architecture of the settlement. And you can see this guy's kind of hovering over this domesticated goat. So there's all this kind of, there's some kind of herding going on. It's not just gazelle as well. What do these sheep and goats here mean? Do these kind of sheep and goats represent kind of the first nibble, the first uptake by indigenous hunter-gatherers? I think it's fairly clear that this is not the case. Not only do we have crop agriculture evidence at these sites, but we also have identity and material culture. The groundstones are the same. The lithic tools are the same. They have game boards and all kinds of things that are also the same. And the focus on gazelle still fits with highland late PPNB animal exploitation practices, because even though they were herding sheep and goats, they're also hunting gazelle as well. They might be a representative of tethered pastoralism, and we see examples of that already kind of occurring at the same time further in the north in the Azraq Basin, and where you're having evidence where you have herders going from Ain Ghazal out into Azraq and then coming back around with their sheep and goats, based on isotope evidence as well as stone tool technologies. But is it really this kind of tethered transhumance? And it seems like it's not impossible, but the level of investment in these triple sets is so high that a quick seasonal visit just to grow some crops really seems like overkill. So the idea that sheep and goats were taken away from the late PPMB interior sediments to keep animals off cropland, it's also kind of contradictory. Or are these desert outposts where our free agents from these transhuman groups from the highlands, is that signaling the arrival of our free agents here? Are we looking at these individuals who kind of broke free of the built environments of the late PPMB highlands and are engaging new domestic livestock-led taskscapes, generating new social relationships and possibly new political alliances? So these could be our first forays of pastoralist strategies into the Badia. And does our story end here? Of course it doesn't. Are these triple sets representative of these? Are they founder herds and they're kind of out and about? And does this somehow intensify? And lo and behold, then we get full-blown Caprine-based herding springing forth. And just to take a few more minutes here, to the east further, we have another phenomenon going on. We have the desert kites. All right, and we have these out in the sort of easternmost edge of the Jaffa Basin, and we find them all over in the Badia in the north as well, including up in the Jalat region, not in Jalat, but up in the northern eastern portion of the desert. And we see these desert kites all throughout eastern Jordan, also into Saudi, and further north in Syria as well. So this is a real phenomenon. And these are used to, we think, used to capture bordered gazelle, these migratory species that form very, very large herds. And they're probably doing these big moves across the Badia. And this is just some examples of different kinds of scales of mobility that these animals themselves engage in. In Iraq, they're kind of quite constrained because the grazing isn't very good. They're not going very far. These on the right in East Africa, these aren't actually gazelle, but it's sort of a nice picture of how you can get things spread out more. And then in places like Mongolia, you get these huge, massive herds that are driving through the steppe. So down here in Jebel Hashabia, where my colleague Wael Abu Azizas and Mohammed Taranwa are working, they're taking a look at some of these kite sites, and they found a string of these kites that are going along the Jebel Hashabia, and there's just sort of a look of the landscape there. And here's a view of that Hamada landscape, and you can see also the tail of the kite in the distance there. And this is just sort of a closer view of these guiding lines for the gazelle. When gazelle are on the run, they do just tend to follow what's there. And so that's how these work. And these walls become much more organized as the convergence points to these enclosures approaches. And at the very end of these enclosures where you saw those little kind of circular points, there are pit traps there. And so Wael has actually excavated several of these now, and this is exactly what these are being used for. And they're quite deep. They're almost 2 meters in some cases. And the walls to these actually rise above the pit trap. And this is also helping to capture those gazelle, because if the gazelle are running and they see the pit trap, they will go around it. So if they build the wall up, that the gazelle actually can't see inside of the pit trap, and then it jumps over it, and then it's too late, and then it falls into it. And what's really pretty nifty about this is that one of these settlements, there's a settlement site out here, and they found engravings on the standing stone here of one of these kites, and they scaled up the engraving to the actual real life kites themselves, and it's a really remarkable, very, very close approximation of what's actually on the ground. So there's a real kind of mental map of what's going on there. These radiocarbon dates are revealing that all of these kites out here in Hashabia that have been excavated so far, they're late PPMB in date. And it's very clear that these were mega traps used for industrial harvesting. And I just want to show you this inscription here. This is not from Hashabia. This is from further north, and it's much later because you can see the inscriptions on it. But it's kind of just invokes that sense of what these kites were about. They're kind of noisy and there's dramatic, and you've got this thundering gazelle herd coming by, and people are waving their hands, and there's shouting, and there's yapping of dogs. This is really kind of a very big, high energy, a memorable kind of event. So most of these kites along this chain have settlements attached to them, and several have now been excavated at this point. And we're just going to take a very brief look at one of these. And again, we see these semi-subterranean kind of circular structures. And what we're looking here on the right, that's all gazelle bones. It's just thousands upon thousands of gazelle bones. And these are all being deposited in a very industrial area. You can see these sort of whacking megaharths, and they're just really going gangbusters on these carcasses, preparing the carcasses of these gazelle. And this is just a sampling of from one small context of all the gazelle bones from this particular site. These settlements also late PPNB and date. So all of these things go together, all right, the settlements and the sites. So where are these gazelle coming from and why should we care? One model is that the gazelle really don't move at all. If there's a lot of water around, they're just going to go kind of out and back and forth from the water, and they're not going to go much further. There's other models that think that these gazelle are migrating up and down the Wadi Sirhan. Then there's ideas that there's just tiny little migrational moves as well. And then there's sort of your long haul kind of classic goiter gazelle movements, perhaps coming all the way from the well-watered Syrian Euphrates region. And at Hashabia, what we're looking at here is basically, first of all, the initial impressions. These gazelle are not from the Hara. These are not from sort of the northeasternmost part of Jordan. Some of them may be coming from the Azraq region, which is interesting because we have already late PPNB herders in that area in a very sort of low level. And then we have gazelle from somewhere else. We're not sure where else. Some of these strontium isotope values do suggest that they're coming from the Syrian sort of Euphrates area. More work needs to be done with this. But the fact that many values overlap with the Azraq gazelle, this is really intriguing as it could really indicate, and I'd like to, it's early days, but the initial establishment of sheep and goats in Azraq are during the late PPNB are somehow already disrupting gazelle populations and their migration routes that were stationed there. So even low-level pastoralism might be impacting gazelle migration routes. And these fluctuations that we're seeing in the strontium isotopes, even here at Jebel Hashabia, might reflect different environmental pressures, but they can also include anthropogenic force ones as well. So we've got kites, we've got settlements, we've got industrialized processing of massive numbers of carcasses. So something weird and wonderful is happening out here. Oh, but here are these guys again. Here's some sheep and goats. So we've got hundreds and hundreds of gazelle being captured in single events. And some 250 kilometers away or so from the Jordanian highlands, we've got these sheep and goats. How did these animals get here so fast is an interesting question itself, given that sheep and goats had really only kind of come down the highlands. But why are they here? Why are they here when there are so many gazelle being captured in these big mass kill events? There's a labor incongruence as well. If you're doing labor processing carcasses and building kites and doing all these kinds of things, who's going to watch the sheep and the goats? It's also a different skill set. It's a different set of skills needed to watch those sheep and goats. It's an own specialized set of labor. And this knowledge might be the key. These are specialized knowledge sets on how to husband sheep, and they have to have come from somewhere else, and they have to be inculcated through a community of practice, through that daily repeated interactions where practical skills in animal care are learned and more esoteric knowledge is transferred. And by esoteric knowledge, I mean the stories that kind of embody the successes or failures of particular decisions associated with animal husbandry. So are we looking again at our free agents, if you will, from the late PPNB highlands who have broken free from hearth and home? And it's really hard to know at this point. We need a lot more excavations from these late PPNB desert body sites. But I argue here that this earliest form of mobile pastoralism is really about politics, okay? And we have completely different communities of practice here. And instead, we have these pastoralism emerging and spreading on the backs of just a few sheep and goats out of this new transhumance-led socio-political landscapes of the highlands onto the desert margins by groups who appear to be from those highland settlements on the basis of their material culture. And Hashabia offers a really interesting perspective because these gazelle hunters are from a completely different community of practice than their neighbors. And this is evidenced by these stone tools that we're looking at here. And it's a completely new techno-complex, so called the Ghassanian, and they have these curved mesas ostensibly for clubbing gazelle over the head, these bifacial pieces and thick blades. This is a completely different group of people here doing their own thing, doing their own communities of practice for gazelle hunting, but also for making stone tools. But there's also these Amuk and Biblos points, and those are from the highlands, all right? So their presence here at first seems really perplexing, but it's less so if we consider the role of established communities of practice and knowledge transfer through everyday interaction and skill building. And the people who's practiced these lithic technological skills associated with Amuk and Biblos points may be those highland free agents with their sheep from the highlands. So the question we have to ask ourselves, if indeed the sheep and stone industries really indicate kind of free agents from the West, how might these agents establish them amongst these kind of Hashabia social groups to the point where communities of practice can be established? What's the political point of entry? This here are these kind of spectacular ritual installations at a couple of these Hashabia sites. So they have these statues and all these kinds of weird and wonderful fossils that have been carefully selected and kind of placed in these buildings. And we don't know if all these Hashabia settlements have these because they haven't all been excavated, but the fact that 2 settlements alone have them is intriguing. And it suggests that while each settlement has their own ritual ethos, there's likely imperfect fidelity in those ritual activities by virtue of them taking place in different settlements with different actors and within different socio-political contexts. So it means there's high potential for free agents to exploit those divergences and to get into the plaques and wedge themselves in there politically. So to kind of close up, the spread of mobile pastoralism into the body in Jordan, it's not the product of any kind of single or simple process that was triggered by crisis to environmental deterioration or climatic amelioration. And rather, it really emerged out of these very long developments in the social worlds and built environments of the pre-modern Neolithic. So that initial motivation to nascent pastoralism via vertical transhumance may have been to get more graze for those sheep and goats, but that could have easily disintegrated in the face of resource stress or intensification of agricultural production. So instead, I would argue that the canalization of mobile pastoralism was really rooted in a shift in taskscapes that promoted the formation of new social and political worlds external to sedentary communities. The role of these desert kites, such as Hashabia, in the establishment and the spread of pastoralism is not really clear, but it does seem like it was part of it, and hosting sheep and goats and human caretakers too. And it does seem apparent that there are very different trajectories to pastoralism here in the southern Badia than in the north and in Azraq, and perhaps also the eastern Badia and the Jordanian panhandle. And there's really much work to be done because these trace outer edges of the first hoof steps to pastoralism are still really little understood. But we do know that that this is all happening just a few hundred years after this first foray out of into the Badia. Pastoralism really takes off. It really amplifies, it really spreads. And what you're looking at here is what appears to be the largely late Neolithic pastoral structures and enclosed structures at Wasad pools out in the eastern Badia. It's a very, very busy place. And the next task then is to figure out why. Thank you very much.